Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 105 of A Conversation With. Today, we have Michael Tsarion back. How are you doing, Michael?
Very well, John. I really appreciate being back on.
Absolutely. Michael and I are going to talk about his recent article on William Blake and on the romantic period during the 19th century, and doubtless we'll have many things to bring up with present events and so forth in that context. Before we get into that, we get caught up with Michael here. Just one brief announcement. I guess two brief announcements, and that is an invitation for everyone to join us on both the 3rd and the 10th of November as one of the familiar faces at Apocrypha Stacy's, David Rios, will be presenting on MK Ultra and that aspect of American history. And then the following week, the 10th, on the Abbasid Caliphate, of all things, in Baghdad. And those are free events. They are private online. You need the Zoom link. And to get that free link there, please write us at Apocrypha Stacy's Institute at AOL.com. I look forward to those things myself. And I think you, the viewers there, would like that too. So without further ado, Michael, what have you been up to for the past year and a half or year since we last spoke?
Yeah, it's been productive. Oh, by the way, your thing on MK Ultra, I don't want to miss that because I'm getting back into that myself. You know, there are Dr. Camerons and all. I always love dipping back into that. That sounds exciting, as does the other one. Wow.
Okay, I'll send you that myself. There you go. You're first in line there. How do you like that?
I'm right into, refreshing my knowledge of those because it's vital. It's so vital. But as far as we've been going, just doing the podcast and odd writings. I'm working on a book that, but I'm not, unlike all the other books, I'm not doing it with any hurry. It's on philosophy. So I could print it now, but I just want to give it a few more passes and polishes. It's really a sort of a magnum opus on philosophy. So it's the only one, probably the only project ever that I haven't rushed or, had that urgency. So it's a completely different dynamic for me, the whole process. And even on the technical side, I need better equipment, to finally even get it into print. So, and I'm not hurrying on that, so there's been a lot of delays, but they've been really positive. And there's been delays in other areas, strangely, and all of them have been positive. I talked about this recently to another guest, who's going through the same thing. And I said, whoa, I've experienced these delays and they've all been positive. Had I rushed this or had I rushed that, I would be kicking myself. So there's been a different dynamic, and I think that going with it as opposed to fighting it, like I normally would, I would be normally just absolutely unable to rest or sleep, if something was held up as it used to be. But, our members have been really, really good. And there's so much that I can take off the shelf. There's stuff I've forgotten was on the shelf, because of their support. You're going, where are we, But then in general, in the conspiratorial sort of framework, we've got the right to our enemies. Say, do you have any more conspiracy theories, in your collection? Because we're kind of out of them, like Professor Black, you wouldn't have any on your list, would you? Because we're out of them, we're proved right in every way, mate. So come on, give us some patronage, give us some alms. You must have something there, something in Roswell. What do you got? Anything, Because there's been this fantastic feeling, so to speak, euphoric, long time coming, I must say, and it's not that we're writhing in it, but it's good to, in one way, it's good to see, because if you've worked so hard for 30 years, bring to the fore conspiracies, it's absolutely marvelous in some left-handed way. You hate to see what it took, but in a left-handed way, there's a certain pride there, saying, I freaking told you so. And, and all heads, sort of eyes look away. Well, we don't want to talk about that because, hello, it's all been verified. So many things that brilliant organizations, brilliant men have said in the past is being vindicated. So that to me has been sort of carrying the flag this year, as a matter of fact, amid the tumult. There has been some positives. So, I hope it's been the same with you as well. There are certain victories, silver linings within the stormy clouds.
My stuff tends to deal more with the humanities and with society, and in particular with education, Michael. But it's interesting you bring that up. When all this kicked off up on 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, hard to believe, but I remember at that time, and in a particular way at that time, there was actually I found a great sense of relief, uh, in the sense that uh, it, I didn't have to save anything anymore. It was going to crash and burn. It was all coming out. It was all there's no saving the society. There's no propping things up. And
No.
I kind of at that point, and there was a weird catharsis to it, as you mentioned. Maybe on I don't know on the, I don't know if I'd phrase on the left hand path, but there is a sense of, as you say, vindication, or okay, I can't, the ship's going down. You did what you could.
There's been a reset in that. We'll have you more on the show to on Enslaved soon to go into it. But there really has been a reset in a positive way. I mean, there's just no way of saying it. It's something like Ayn Rand said. I'll paraphrase her in the sense that go ahead, be ignorant, choose the path of irrationality and ignorance, even on a national scale. But then don't tell me that you can avoid the consequence of that, which is destruction. You have been told, you have been warned, you've even been warned about enemies at the gates. You won't listen, so shall it be. And there's we didn't create that seesaw. People like you and I did not create the dynamic that if you go up, we go down, and vice versa. Yeah, you taught us to play the game, right? We'll play by your rules. When we go up, you go down. I didn't invent it.
Right.
And I have said, actually, if people track back to the earliest recordings, they will actually hear me say that until people's asses are burning, there will be no actual change. And it's the same on the existential level, right? People have seen political things that have helped them, get back to some basic traditions and so on. Yeah, that's the starting place. But we need a further, of course, a certain demographic will go further to look right into the depths of American history, the Puritans, the Pilgrim Fathers, what were some of the negs, as well as the positives there. What about now? Could there not, after all of these tumult of the left, the extreme left, might that not be something that another group hiding in the forest and the trees, the ultra right wing evangelic fundamentalist crowd, might they not be in some way ready to benefit? Trying to get an understanding of geopolitics, not just of America, but of the world. There's precedents for everything I've just said. That's why there are these tremendous polarities. You can have something that looks crazy on one side. Yeah, try to see what the magician's left hand is doing while you're watching the right. And so in America, I'm pretty conservative myself, but I also don't like some of the more extremists on that side who are just waiting for the day. And these are billionaires. These are people who are phenomenally wealthy, in groups like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, those spawn of the founding fathers who have a literalist attitude. They don't like you. They don't like me. They don't like a lot of people. And so watch out for these swings. So there's a lot to be conscious of, So when you're listening to the Dinesh D'Souza, it's wonderful material, or this other person that you like, it's wonderful material. Right. But also start thinking, where's that coming from? Don't get obsessed by it. Don't stop listening any more than you should be. Stop listening to the narrative of, say, the ultra left. I'm about getting all, the hands around all the information in a very unbiased way. So that you can see all the voices. And that's what we try to do on the podcast, is all sorts of different people coming on. Some of them are completely not where we are.
Sure.
But I want to hear what you've got to say. And if you look like you're solution oriented, then even more so. I mean, you and I know, look, the solution starts with right education right from the off. And since America has never had that, it's something to build again. It's something to get into the grassroots and hold on to and say, well, there's one of the solutions. I'm unlike you, because when you're running around your garden, tearing your hair out and going, woe is me, and rolling like a baby in the grass. It's all over the political system, blah, blah, blah. You, John, me, we know, remember a little thing called education? I've been building it over here. I've got that solution by the roots. What about you? Why don't you join the fight? Why don't you educate yourself and other people? There's always solutions. So something burns down, instead of jumping off the cliff in hysteric, insanity, you just go, well, one brick on top of another brick. That's the way it was done in the early days of education. We fought hard for it in centuries past. Great men who built the system, the evil ones, the John Deweys and all, who try to pull it down. But I'm always a believer, or at least my kind of man, alpha man, is the one who goes, I'm building it right back from the start. I don't have that level of futility. Dust myself off, get up and walk on and serve the truth.
Yeah, yeah. Every minute that we spend rolling about like a baby in the grass, that's a minute we could be doing something. That's right.
Yes, it is. You got it. You nailed it.
Now, for the viewers here, Michael and I got back in touch because Michael had used a phrase on his podcast, and Michael's links are going to be down below here on BitChute and YouTube. Michael had used a reference to a Punch and Judy show, and that's an old type of street performance for children with puppets, and it's been a long time since I heard that. But we're going to talk now about a long time ago. We're going to talk about William Blake and the time of Punch and Judy shows, and the time of the French Revolution, and the time of a lot of things that, well, they seem they've gone by the wayside, but we'll find out that they're quite relevant, and that Blake's mind is quite relevant to our discussion here. You know, Michael, as I was getting my thoughts together for our chat here, I was thinking about the phenomena that I was thinking about 100 years ago, but certainly 200 years ago in the time of Blake. And I encourage the viewers to pause right now and to read that article by Michael to understand, you know, really where we're coming from. But I was just thinking, a lot of guys 100 years ago, and certainly 200 years ago, they were even though they were 200 years out from where we are, and they didn't quite know where we'd end up. It's funny how they could perceive certain things coming. They could perceive certain things coming, and whilst we may think the French Revolution and the American Revolution are and the Enlightenment are as dusty as mummies, there are such dynamics there that obviously come into play. So, would you tell us a bit about William Blake, Michael, and his context, and maybe just a smidge about his philosophy, which we can develop?
Oh, glad to, John. I'm so grateful that that we can get a chance to talk. I've been studying Blake since I was 5 years old, mostly in the dark, and this is just the last short time, maybe a year or so, that I got to write about him. Although I do mention him in all my books, right, in passing. But the man was so eclectic. I mean, he should be defining the word eclectic. There's nobody as eclectic as he, almost to the point of, super eclecticism. So you can approach his work at many different angles. And he was very influential to some people like Carl Jung and Owen Barfield and others who came after him. And that's just a short list. Even James Hillman, I'm absolutely sure, was deeply influenced by him. But although I do cite other people in the article, predecessors like George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher, and all, that's not to say that Blake is really on their same level. It can give that impression because I mentioned other people around him. This was a unique individual, right? Who it's not the greatest idea to necessarily link him with others. In fact, he's been many times misrepresented. In fact, the photograph you're showing is again a misrepresentation. He actually didn't really look like that. Everybody that came into contact with him and his ideas had to, in some way, normalize the guy. Like you said, about 200 years ago, he was such a enfant terrible that they had to even try and tone him down. And so this portrait, which he probably fought for against, okay, great. It was in a style that was popular at the time, epitomized by artists like Sir Joshua Reynolds, that Blake called Sir Sloshoa Reynolds, so you can imagine. And yes. So they insisted on taking this fiery, red-headed, maniacal guy and making him look like a gent of the parlor, in the salon. It's ridiculous. So I myself always laugh at that. But yeah, he had a small team of great patrons and friends. They weren't able to support him as well as they might. There's all sorts of reasons why that was. They just didn't understand his thought. But again, he stands out. He's not to be, although I mention him always in context of other great idealists and non-materialist philosophers, let's always make sure that we know that this man is iconic. And he was far above all of these other people that I might mention. And he influenced many people, that came. I'm a big believer that almost everything in Carl Jung comes from William Blake. I think I did an article a few months ago to try and just open the door to that concept, because I've never seen enough people honor it. But that's I tried to. There's another one there called Blake on the Unconscious. This one we're talking about today is Blake and the Materialists. But in Blake on the Unconscious, I just wanted to open the door, just a little aside, because I think that's been left out. I mean, why is it that nobody is, taking the four types or even the archetypes in general back to Blake? I mean,
Mm.
what do I need to do? I mean, hold your hand. I mean, I'm talking to academia. I'm not an academic, and yet why? Or I'm not an academiac either. So why are these people? It just seems a lacuna. So my articles always tried to fill in a few gaps there. Because there is a lot that later people who are really eminent owe to the man.
What struck me there when I was reading your article, Michael, is this division that seems to happen during the Enlightenment, and the differences between the Eastern European Enlightenment, which Blake seemed to be influenced by, although himself British, and then the more mechanistic and mechanical French and British incarnations of the same. And can you hash those out broadly, and then maybe speak about Emanuel Swedenborg and the relationship to Blake there?
Yeah, there's a close connection. Swedenborg is a monster of a figure. He alone should be brought into the curriculum. Blake only had a difficulty with him only in terms of a kind of see, Blake was not a Gnostic, and therefore, although there are Gnostic elements within his work, but that's part of his eclectic. Imagine that you are a painter and you like using a lot of colors. That's why Blake has elements of Gnosticism, but he's got elements of Judaism and Christianity. Hermeticism would be the primary brush that he used. But he has all these other comments. He's got atheism in there. He's got all sorts of extraordinary things going on. And at the time he lived, there was the French War. There was a Napoleonic War going on. And so books that were coming from the continent were censored. Yeah, we thought it was only a matter of now. Nothing you've seen in the modern world is of now. There was an embargo on books. If the British government could have embargoed thought, they would have done it at this period, And Blake was a Sagittarius, which means he was a very fiery, independent kind of person. But there was an embargo of books, and it's only because of these patrons that he had in England who were wealthy enough to have a little bit of black market, a minor version of smuggling in certain books. Their wives would carry them in their handbags. So there was a certain amount of Jakob Bohm, Meister Eckhart. It wasn't a complete closed shop. And so Blake's patrons were able to get hold of mostly these German, as you said, the Germanic mystics is really what they were, who influenced the Romantic tradition. All the Romantic philosophers were delving in these people. But during this war, the Napoleonic times, Blake and other people couldn't get hold of these things. And in many ways, if you were even found with them, that would mean a long jail sentence and a kind of a dungeon. Blake escaped that type of fate many, many a time. And in the Jakob Bohms, he reprises a lot of their ideas. He's a fan of those men, and he was a contemporary of Hegel, right? I think because he was part of these salons, he was able to talk a lot about it, and you see these motifs turning up in his writings. He was a very revolutionary kind of person in his young years, and so he was really into what was happening all around him, and that helped him develop this thought. So, although there was this embargo, you can take it as for granted that he did indeed have access to books that were either lent to him and then he had to give them back or whatever, or coming to these friends' houses, he would have heard about them, and this included Swedenborg. And then after the Napoleonic War finished, then the books were allowed back in. So, but although he took influence from George Berkeley and other idealists and even mystical types like Swedenborg, his own, like I say, he's a Sagittarius, so his own thought is finally going to emerge from this cocoon, of knowledge. And he was so utterly, he could pinpoint where they were going wrong in their thought. He'd like this part of them, some statement, whatever, and then he would not like something else, and he would write about it. And then being this kind of Sagittarius type, he had a really incredible sense of humor in which he would snipe at them. He would ridicule them, Locke's Looms and Newton's sleep and the satanic mills. and all these diatribes against artists. He was very into Gothic art, Gothic just as a synonym for Germany.
Hmm.
The great Gothic artists who used line and proportion and all. He didn't like a lot of this weird, what we would now, think of as modern art. He believed in line, he believed in proportion and things like that. And he was a great champion of the imagination in general. So it's really, like I say, he's so eclectic, it's hard to really nail him down, but because there's all sorts of elements in his thought. But definitely, he backed off on the supernaturalism, and he backed off on the Gnosticism, even though casual readers immediately, because they're brainwashed, oh, he's a Gnostic, he talks about these archons and all that. Yeah, he does talk about archons, but they don't just come from Gnosticism. There's a Hermetic reading of them as well.
Mm.
There's even a Druidic. He lived in England. His name was Blake, but his family name was Black. And there's a lot of people think that there's an Irish connection there. But in any case, there's other traditions in this world that talk about, the daemons and the archons. It's not just from Gnosticism. People have to really, expand their idea of what he might have been talking about.
It was interesting. I didn't realize when I was reading your article, it came to me that some of these expressions that were coined by Blake, just is that so mind forged manacles, I think was one that you mentioned, or the satanic mills, or these expressions that enter, at least in the 19th century, they enter into larger usage, and those are coined by Blake, huh?
Yes, the poem Jerusalem, for instance, my sword shall not sleep in my hand until we have built Jerusalem and England's green and pleasant land. All sorts of, he was a poet. And in his very early stages, he just did write unincendiary poetry. It's political, it's about slavery, it's about women's rights, it's about the goings on of, the evil ones and stuff like that. He wrote a beautiful poem called Auguries of Innocence. He might have been inspired by William Wordsworth's. Did Wordsworth come before him or not? I can't remember, but Wordsworth wrote a book called Auguries of Innocence. Or is that the Blake poem? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Wordsworth wrote Intimations of Immortality. And Blake wrote this one called Auguries of Innocence, in which it's a whole paean to animals. How you shouldn't even have a bird in the cage or a fish in a bowl or anything. A wonderful, wonderful natural poem. Almost, and it's laced with extraordinary, accusations against people who do treat animals badly. So he had a very strong connection to nature. Although his later poetry has tremendously idiosyncratic things to say about nature. It's absolutely unbelievable, right? But in his early works, he was into nature, preservation of nature. You can read him then as a pantheist who said, take care of the world. You're guests in the planet. Do you trash a hotel room or, when you live with a friend? Do you trash the place? Of course not. He goes, well, we're trashing the earth. He would walk out of his door and he'd write a poem about the fact that there was a gardenness, a beauteous garden of trees and forests on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, the street ended in an abattoir or slaughterhouse. So he would go at this, and he was very, very interested in showing the paradoxes and the sort of contradictions in human behavior. That's just for a start. And as I say, said in the article, that psychologists owe him an immense debt. And I tried in that other article, to a little bit prove that case.
Yeah, so a few things there that I could respond to with that is one of which, besides Blake kind of being, I guess, in a type of eye of the storm between the American and French revolutions, and then the later blow-ups in the mid-19th century. There's also, as you've intimated, we have to put Blake in the context of the Industrial Revolution and the upsets to life, and not just the life of man, but the life of nature as well. And that dichotomy there. And again, even though Blake's in our perspective, he's at the beginning of this or near enough of the Industrial Revolution, he can still see that war on nature and that particular real shift that happens after the agrarianism which came before. And then the other thing that strikes me is, just parenthetically, not related to Blake, but with Swedenborg at that time. Swedenborg migrates over here, not physically, but his ideas migrate over here, and particularly over here being New England in America. And he was very, very influential in the Transcendentalists up in Massachusetts and throughout the country, but especially that was kind of the nucleus there. So it's interesting how Swedenborg enters the English-speaking world, because I think he was Swedish, wasn't he?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He advised the kings over there.
Mm-hmm.
He was an absolute genius. I mean, it's amazing to me, you know, that we don't have his work as just as big as Shakespeare or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
He's a bridge builder and engineer, and I mean, he involved himself in engineering projects for the King of Sweden that still today boggle the mind. These are giants, you know. It's like great man theory. Remember that? Yeah. Well, you can start with Emanuel Swedenborg on the top of the list. But you're right. Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman. Whitman was a poet.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Who was influenced by Blake, talking about Swedenborg here, but you're quite right to bring up the Transcendentalists, because there is no doubt that they were deeply influenced by Blake. You know, Thoreau, Whitman was even a poet himself, the others as well. And I think that they were really, really heavily influenced by him. They weren't necessarily deists. See, the kind of Christianity that got Blake all fired up was called deism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, all the founding fathers were deists. So when you come to the American tradition, you've already got anti-Blakean sort of people in government. It's not a good sign, right? The champion of imagination, the champion of a different pantheistic way of seeing. The Transcendentalists were into it, and they should have been in power, but they were ridiculed and they were sort of hinterlanded. These are men who should have been, your Walt Whitmans should have been in government, or at least their progeny, their supporters. Instead, you got this hardcore of deists with their absurd ideas about, you know, God starting the clockwork universe and then, you know, going off somewhere else to do whatever he was doing. And this is just, was so, it's not, having said that though, that must never be taken that Blake was a Christian. This is another mistake. He was not. He was not a Gnostic, and he was not a Christian in any sense of the word. But it's very difficult to prove that because of the, you know, people's programming. And because he himself makes it difficult because he's always talking about Jesus. But he was talking about Jesus and the Christ as a synonym for poetic genius, a kind of a state of consciousness that we have. And a closer analogy would be like when Carl Jung talked about the self, the imperial self, or he didn't use that term, but the self in caps. Blake was talking about Jesus as that self. No question about that. But these are sort of minor points. It's just that the American experiment was, Blake had tremendous hope in it. He personified the whole thing as the spirit of Orc, one of his characters, because he was a mythographer. He created iconography. He was a mythiopoeic in that sense of creating a whole new dramatis persona. And guess what? Ireland, you know, had its own daemon, you know, whatever. And America was under this Zoa, or this, not really a Zoa, but sort of an emanation of a Zoa called Orc, who's a sort of a blend of Jesus and Lucifer, strangely, you know, very, very iconoclastic. But really, it's Jesus in the mode of throwing the moneylenders out of the temple kind of mode. Jesus that embodies truth, and truth by its very nature is not only apotropaic, but almost like white blood cells. It has a defensive, aggressive side. And that's what he was looking at. So every part of these other doctrines or dogmas are expanded or explained in a way by Blake that some people coming from the Christian world go, oh, he's one of us, he's a Christian, only to find horrific things like in the marriage of heaven and hell, which they certainly wouldn't agree with. So, oh God, I thought we had another patron there and that doesn't work. Look at those things he's saying there. And, you know, another guy will come as a Gnostic, and they do, thinking, oh, our patron is William Blake. Wouldn't bite down too hard on that if you know, if you don't want to, that won't work. And so it is. And they just can't agree on the fact that he's just a Hermeticist, but he's a Hermeticist of monumental proportions, who knew a great deal about what he was speaking of. And of course, you know, his attacks on materialism are particularly brilliant, as were those of George Berkeley before him. But they're like almost, it's like they're two guys, a duo saying, you go that way and I'll go this way. So we'll cut off our enemy, you know, at the pass, and you'll use a hunk of flint and I'm going to use this golden bow, right? But we'll get them between us. So they have different weapons, but the same objective, really.
One thing before we get too deep into this, that I just wanted to buttress something you had brought up about the censorship of the time. In preparing for this, Michael, uh, I come across some information that the house that Blake was living in, the tenement, and that whole neighborhood, and this was a sign of the times that he lived in. You mentioned the kind of oppressiveness and the control of the British regime, especially again in the wake of the French Revolution. You can't have radicals there, and they actually made the tenants in Blake's apartment sign something that would become more familiar in the labor struggle about a century later, which is they actually made them sign little contracts that they didn't hold any radical tendencies, and the same type of nonsense you see with your unilateral contracts when you use Facebook or whatever. It's the same thing. You have to do this pro forma boilerplate thing that you're okay with the reigning ideology, and we think this stuff is new. We think this stuff is new, and it's not. Even Blake had to go through this.
And his parents, they were Muggletons or whatever the little cult they were, the little sect. And oh yeah, you were jumping through. Persecution would follow for the slightest thing, breaking a window. It's just extraordinary. That it really, really is. And he fought all his life against that kind of injustice.
Michael, I have a quote here, and then I'd like to take things to maybe kind of analyzing Blake's art and this sort of thing. And you have a few examples in your article, in fact, Blake's physical art. But before we get there, you've used a word which some of us might not be familiar with. That you've said that Blake is a hermeticist. Can you explain that if we're unfamiliar for the
Yes,
viewers?
it's very important because, like Swedenborg, all of these different thinkers, and including those German mystics we talked about earlier, these would be people like Jakob Böhm, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas Cusa. One of the big problems I see is, and it also happened with Jung. When Jung wrote his Red Book and a couple of other works, he immediately was labeled a Gnostic. There's a whole school out there promoted by a Gnostic leader called Stefan Haller. I like reading his work, but he went too far. He tried to see, they all tug and pull at a great man. And they said, you're a Gnostic. And I go, well, we've got this arm hanging here and you got the rest of it. And so there is a danger that a Berkeley is a subjective idealist, like you're ever going to work that what that is. Immanuel Kant, transcendental idealist, transcendental idealist. Pull the other one, right? And then the definition goes on and on and on. And so this categorization is bad for all thinkers, but it's catastrophe when you talk about Blake. And so Hermeticist is about as general as you're going to get. Now, and it's accurate, because a Hermeticist is really one who's an esotericist, who does not deny the value of the earth. He doesn't devalue earthly existence, life, the body. Buddhism at the core is Gnostic. It denies the body. They're very cunning about it because they knew it didn't work. So they shifted the chairs, which in Buddhism is dead easy to do because there's millions of different kinds of Buddhism and many kinds of scriptures and texts and books. So when that doesn't work, you just keep going like that until you get something for an ear. They go, oh, that's just lovely. But when you read deep down in Hinduism, when all of these paths, you find the Gnostic core. Which is not good. It's unhealthy. And the same is with lots of religion, the religious dogma, including the Bible. St. Paul is completely Gnostic. It's obvious when you know what you're looking at. Judaism, aspects of that are very, very Gnostic because they purged anybody who wasn't. And that problem has continued up to the present day. Now, the trouble is that Gnosticism, Judaism, Pauline Christianity have nibbled and stolen and appropriated and cannibalized hermetic elements, put it in, like pepper and salt into a dish. And so in the end, nobody is going to want to take tweezers. Well, you can't. It's all mixed into the dish. So my life study from the 80s has been to, well, I don't care. I'm going to try and do it anyway. And I've gone in with the tweezers to try and pluck out the Gnostic elements, or let's put it the other way, pluck out the hermetic elements that belong in a separate category, uncontaminated by the porridge of Gnosticism. It's a thankless task, right? But on Enslaved, I've got two programs on Gnosticism in the premium section for people. And then, again, after many, many years and because of support from members, finally got that one off the shelf, and it's definitive. I mean, anybody coming away from that should really get the point about Gnosticism and the negatives. But at least they'll understand the thinking of a Gnostic. It's deranged thinking. It's what I call mysteria, thinking about things uh, that are unreal, living in our ideas about a thing, and not double checking those ideas to see if they're relevant, and maybe that they're irrelevant, maybe they clash up against other things you need to know. This is where Blake comes in himself, as I'm asking you to think about your thinking, and wonder whether your thinking about your thinking is in some sense deranged. And in my younger years, 5 and 6 years old, we hung around in Lambeth and in South Malton Street in London, where Blake hung out. And so I was very deeply caught up. The one positive thing of any sort of parental background there was I was exposed to certain of these great names, and then I took it on further. But his stomping grounds and the bookshops he visited in those days, were familiar to me. So that I learned a great deal about that, and his art, as you say. Again, apologies to people reading the articles. I sometimes use the same pictures over and over again, but there's a good reason for that. There's a good reason for that, because they become iconic, and you'll not forget them. If you see the same paintings and then see the description, you'll sort of remember then. Oh yeah, I know what Michael said about that painting, and it just helps coalesce and consolidate some of the bizarre, because this thinking is not normal. Hermetic thinking of this nature, and I stay very true to what Blake is talking about, isn't really natural because of all the the schooling of those satanic mills that we've had. So I try to make it simpler rather than bombard people with all of everything to do with Blake. I just try to center upon a couple of the most important things. And then if you're reading a George Berkeley or somebody else, it'll gel. If you're reading Jung, there'll be a cross-pollination. Go, oh, didn't Blake say that? And the journey starts from there. But if you bombarded anyone in a book or an article with only Blake, that can be deficient as well, because the thinking is really, really right-brained and not quite familiar to us at all. That's why there's so many misunderstandings about the man.
We'll look shortly at some of those pieces there from the article, those selection. Maybe we can kind of chew over those bits. But before we do that, Michael, there's a quote or two that I've taken here from your article. And again, for the viewers, the articles are and Michael's site is down below in the description. So please do read this, and then read some other stuff by Michael. But here, let's focus on this one here, and then break it down a bit. Okay, so Blake was attentive to all of this, but he saw the reconcilement between scientists and theologians as a dark day for the world. The world's foulest criminals and malefactors had just formed a monster conglomerate in the Hermit, thanks to the Hermit of Königsberg. Speaking of Kant, I take it.
That's right.
This was not progress, said Blake, but the situation was desperate and something had to be done. The delusion upon which scientism and theology rested had to be exposed before all. And we'll get to the second bit in a little bit. But let's look at this here. The delusions upon which scientism and theology had rested had to be exposed before all. So can you dig into that a bit more for us, Michael?
Well, yeah, because remember, Blake's this nobody, and Kant is one of the fathers of the modern age. Sounds strange to say that since he lived in the 1700s, but given the trends of thought after Kant, they were all answering Kant. Either critically, Hegel, Schelling, and Fichte were critical. Fichte was the genius that brought Kant his whole house of cards. Don't ask me how a young teenager can do that, but he did it. And then Hegel and Schelling felt confident enough to go on, from that point on, and also critique Kant, and they did successfully. But Blake's watching this whole thing. He's out there in the wings, and he's not liking any of it. Not the later Germans I just mentioned, but he's upset about Kant in many ways. And but one of the things that Kant had done is by clipping the wings of reason, and these are Kant's own words, I make way for faith. And and maybe Kant was the nicest guy in the world. People say he was. Maybe this was not done with any ulterior motive. As far as his philosophy had led him up to believe, it all hooks on one strange quirk, and that is this: we understand the concept unknown, because the scientist says, yeah, it's unknown right now, but that's what science is all about. We're going to know it tomorrow. No, Kant did not mean unknown or noumenal in that way. He tried to focus on an unknowable, that no amount of science, thought, running around the world, Indiana Jones like or anything, is ever going to tell you what the unknowable is. And he called that in German noumenal. In fact, we get the opposite, phenomenal, from him. He invented the word. And the noumenal is that which is not just unknown. So that still leaves science in, doesn't it? Well, of course, a lot of things are unknown. They're mysteries. Yeah, biology, we're going to find out all about it. How the eye works and the endocrine system. No, he said, no. The real is unknowable. Now, as I said, some young German men really, no way, right? They ideologically opposed this. Their philosophies are based in disproving Kant. But just before you get into that and you say unknowable, this then Kant had then said, and that's the limits of science, limits of reason. This book was called The Critique of Pure Reason. Bizarre title, and all it means is finding the limits of reason, just like you'd find the limits of a country or borders. And so he said that the solution, but he left a way out. He said maybe the faith of the religious man, or just faith, might do the trick. I'm not hopeful. I've told you that the wall is impenetrable, but on a better day, maybe the faithful have access. Well, that was it. The Christian world that had been, beaten bloody with the new scientific developments for hundreds of years. David Hume, all his predecessors, your Descartes, they'd all been fighting this, and religion had been losing the race. Immanuel Kant's greatest achievement, why even neo-Kantians continued after him right up to the present day. Some of the top deans of the top colleges in Britain and probably America would describe themselves as neo-Kantians, and actually be kind of proud of it because of this unison that I just briefly mentioned in the article, which is that Kant opened the door. He was the perfect ambassador. Welcome ye all. And the scientists begrudgingly went, well, I guess, okay, he's right about the limits of reason. There are things we maybe don't know. And the religious man was just overjoyed because, as I say, they'd been losers and nobody wanted to invite them to any parties anymore, except, hardcore Christians with their dogma. But Kant had done one thing better. He had said, actually, I'm endorsing your dogma. They went, thank you, brilliant. And so these two contingents then joined together forevermore, actually. This is the modern world opened with this, where you can have a Dawkins sit down with some clergyman, and their arguments are pretty fatuous. They look like their opponents, but they're not, because they've all got Immanuel Kant's little, pass card. So the whole thing is a fiasco. The things that they're arguing over are fairly uninteresting, actually. How did evil get in the world if there's a good God? Now, people don't know that. As I said, this kind of thinking is often a bit counterintuitive. People today, because it's on TV and it looks real big, and these guys have all got triple PhDs and big head, big IQs. The subjects that they look like they're talking about seem really, really important. They're not, because they're not at loggerheads. These two teams are run by the same management. That's what you got to realize. It doesn't stop you being interested in the subject matter. Hey, it might be an interesting subject, a question to find out about. Well, okay, great. But watch behind the scenes. Immanuel Kant, the great magician, brought them together. And there's many, many, many implications of that. And Blake was saying, what have you just done? They don't belong together. I want to destroy both of them. But the point is, why did you even bring them together to make them into this more of a monstrous artifact? And the thing is that, then you have to understand Blake's thinking about scientism or science, the limits of it and so on, and religion too. What does he mean by critiquing both of those? What does it mean for Christianity, for instance?
Excellent. So just to recap, and also as a highlighting of some of the fine prose in this article, we read, the world's foulest criminals and malefactors had just formed a monstrous conglomerate thanks to the Hermit of Königsberg. That's a great sentence in various ways. And thank you for explaining that, Michael. The next piece, and then we'll transition to some of this artwork here that comes from Blake. And I think I didn't even know some of this stuff came from Blake, but I've definitely seen it floating around that you mention it. But let's just look at this one here. So Blake dedicated his life to the project. However, after his death, most of his works were deliberately burned by an associate. We are left with mere fragments of his corpus. Sparse as they are, they contain profound critiques of religion and materialism. Many later thinkers, men such as Owen Barfield and Carl Jung, as we've mentioned, etc., were inspired by Blake's idiosyncratic writings, poetry, and artistic creations. And that's remarkable how often when one reads through figures of the 19th century or 18th century, how often their works were burned. It was almost de rigueur for certain social classes to burn all of their correspondence, and terribly frustrating for a historian or a biographer. But can you elaborate on that? Has there been any? I guess it would only have to be speculation on what was lost. But or another way to phrase it, from what we have from Blake, you know, those fragments that we do have of his corpus of writings, is it reasonably certain that we have the full scope of his worldview with those fragments, or not? Or there are elements that maybe he probably wrote about something and then there's just a reference to it, and are there openings or black holes, shall we say, to Blake's worldview because of that? Or do we have a relatively systematic understanding of his thought, Michael, based off of those fragments?
There's no consensus. And this guy was an associate who thought that the writings were so devilish, just misunderstood what was in there. Probably a lot of quotes about Lucifer and all. And so what, just said, right, it will ruin Blake's reputation. Oh, dear, dear. And whatever lunacy was in his mind, because you could have just sequestered them. But of course, it is difficult to go into somebody's art studio and haul out big, giant copper plates on which he did his etchings. And what are you going to put them? Where are you going to hide them? I mean, it's just it's largely impossible. Doesn't mean you go out and burn everything. So yeah, nobody really knows for sure. My feeling is that a lot was lost. I've been studying him since 5 years old, remember? So you're quite right. Now, an artist will come out and say, although texts were burned, his art had deep meaning. Just look at the paintings. But that, of course, is difficult for people who don't have that aesthetic ability. So a great deal has been gleaned from what's been left, and a great deal has been gleaned from the actual artwork itself, that must be said. And then a lot has been gleaned also because his poetry was so rich. He could write a reasonably short poem. I have another article called The Sick Rose, which is one of these short poems. I mean, talk about encapsulating so much information in those short poems. In fact, he could do it in 2 lines. That famous one, to see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wild flower, and so on. This man could do it in 2 lines. It could shatter whole philosophies, shatter empires. So consensus says, we've got enough. And that's why you'll never hear what I've just written there. You'll never hear that be spoken of, that his work was burned, because it's so rich. They're still going through it to this day. But that doesn't mean that volume is more, one still must note the reality of the fact that this man's work was purged and burned for whatever reason. And that is a tragedy, you see. So yeah, we could know more about his Druidic roots. There's a lot of there's a lot of yeah. And remember, his own work is terribly fragmentary because of these losses. So what they've tried to put together as the corpus is fragmentary, puzzling. It puts you off, because he'll have a character who's doing one thing in one book and completely different in another book, some more heroic in one and then this little subservient thing on another. And so you just can't work it out. So the difficulty is with Blake is that it is completely scatterbrained. Yeah. So, and that's not a good thing. That's why his teachings haven't been sort of brought to light. And if you then compare that tragedy with somebody like a Salvador Dali or another artist who's just everything's on display and under glass and never had a problem, and there's Leonardo da Vinci, and it's tragic. The cities of the world are filled with your Da Vinci's and your Rodin, and nobody ever bothered, sequestering Pizarro or like Monet or anybody. And Blake is the one who had the real sense, and was a mystic of the highest order, and it's his work that hit the flames, not Jackson Pollock. Yeah, then you start writhing at night, like I used to do. Go, I don't like this. I don't like this. I feel ill. The hell.
What a good summary of the work of poetry that you gave us just now, Michael. That in one or two lines you could shake an empire. That's very good.
You're bloody right.
A great synopsis of the whole experiment of poetry. By the by, when you mentioned a couple times your early introduction to Blake, were you introduced to Blake by way of his children's works, or was there some other early introduction?
No, it was just books of poetry,
Mm,
and the imagery of him was. I was into all these poets: Walter de la Mare, uh, uh, oh, Jared Manley Hopkins,
mm,
uh, all the mystical poets from Thomas Traherne through John Donne.
mm,
I was deeply into. I'm a hopeless poet and artist, but I loved reading about these people. Thomas Vaughan, the metaphysical poets. As you move up, I would say that Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We're all brought up on that in England that I knew. Not anymore. But
mm.
Wordsworth again. I think it was a mighty soul, and Coleridge, Thomas Hardy. I read all his novels. We were brought up on English literature very heavily, and Blake's iconography stood out.
Let's take a look at some of that iconography. In fact, you have a few pieces here, and I shouldn't imagine you have them all memorized, Michael. But are there any ones that you'd like to look at in particular from your selection here on the article?
Well, there's only a few. If you go up, I think we've got. Oh well, yeah, that would take a lifetime to understand. Let's move up.
Move up, okay.
This is actually a fact.
This one,
Yeah,
keep going.
here's one which is part lampoon and part deep understanding of Sir Isaac Newton sitting at the bottom of the ocean amongst the sludge and the bug-eyed animals, working out a mathematical conundrum. So Blake was a bit of a lampooner and a cartoonist in that sense, while he also had a metaphysical point to make. And even the fact that he's stark naked, hunched over, he's saying this is the scientist of today who is blinded. You can either take the ocean two ways. The ocean is, you see, Isaac Newton died, and his last words are famous. I feel like a child walking on the beach, turning over little stones while the whole ocean of the mystery of the unknown lies in front of me. It's a famous line from Newton. Along comes Blake and goes, right, I'm going to dissect that. You are exactly that, a child turning over, the whole, and here he is putting him in the ocean of the so-called mist. It's all, it's a brilliant humor, great puns. He goes, well, I'll take his last words and actually paint them up for you. Here he is sitting in that ocean of immense knowledge and wisdom and hasn't the faintest idea what he's about. He's actually in it. And and to him, it's a dark abyss, but he's grown used to the abyss. In other words, the gloom, the ignorance. And there he is working out, with 2 + 2 = 4. What a good boy am I. And Blake is ridiculing all mathematics, all science, all geometry, anything that builds the world. And that's, of course, incomprehensible to people. That's why a poet would say that. And that's when, the difficulties begin. You've got to understand why he would say that. What is underlying a statement like that? Is this man mad? Well, most of the world scholars and academia have thought him mad, have declared him mad, and they just put him into that category. And so it's becomes very difficult. Then the compasses become important. What are they? What kind of thinking do they represent? He called it ratio. What is the parchment all about? That scroll that looks like a scroll. It's meant to look like a scroll for a reason. That's a symbol. His hunched overness, like Nebuchadnezzar, or the great iconic figures are in a tortured way. The fact that he's so muscular, the musculature, these are all symbols. Every single thing is a symbol. Because remember, didn't you have Pythagoras and some great geometricians? Didn't you have Vitruvius and Pacioli and Fibonacci? So Blake couldn't be citing them, could they? Because they talked about the moral universe. And the answer is no, he's not. So the tools in the hands of a Pacioli or a Fibonacci, the compass, are used differently than in the hands of somebody like a reductionist who's in the gloom. So it's not that he's against science, but he wants the science to represent, as he wanted the religion, he called it the natural religion. He wanted the natural religion to speak of the moral universe that is evolutionary, that wants you to grow, not grow just biologically with your DNA and all of that, but grow mentally, grow to what he would call a fourfold vision. to mental vision, to poetic genius, which he personified as different deities in his work, sort of daemonic figures. And then he would talk about them. See, he personified them into characters, just like he personifies Newton here as all science of the materialistic kind. He would go on to personify all the meritorious, concepts in various figures. And the highest figure in his iconography, who represents ultimate truth, so much so that it can awaken us all to what needs to be, where our original state, let's say, is a figure he calls Jerusalem. But everybody associates that term not with a lady or a woman or a goddess, but with the city of Jerusalem. So again, odd thinking, odd illusions. Lewis Carroll used to have the illusions and the weirdness. Oh, you haven't met William Blake yet. It's all over the place. But again, Lewis Carroll, the great master of Oxford or whatever, the great master, his books weren't summarily, he wasn't given a thrashing and all his work taken out and burned in the back garden, was it? So yeah, there's difficulties. Let's just say that.
Well, a picture or a painting here can say 1,000 words, and that's a great synopsis, as you say, of the reductionist or the materialist scientist. You could switch out Newton's name for any number of scoundrels today, and you'd still have the same truth coming across.
And for me, the ultimate image here is that he's using his left hand. That's the left. It's called the right brain, but they didn't know all about that. The left side is the sinister side, right? So it wouldn't work in today's parlance to do this because the left hand represents the right brain. But take that little anecdote away, and you see that he is talking about the left side, which is downward pointing and earthy. So what he's doing that is that mathematicians and these scientists, their vision of the universe becomes universal. And then they use the same laws to reinforce what they already know. That Kantian thing again about, if I take away the unknowable, you're left with phenomenon, and that's the knowable. So as far as Blake is concerned, yeah, you want to go around and keep measuring the thing, the limits of the known? Well, go ahead. But that doesn't mean that you have the right then to adopt a materialistic worldview. Carry on with your job. You've assigned it well enough. We know what you do in those universities, but how dare you take the confines of the known, which you know is limited, which you already know is circumscribed, and how dare you then form a empty, and he called it Locke's looms, the looms of Locke that just spin out tapestry after tapestry of lies until the whole world is drowned in the skeins of this nonsense, or other anecdotes he used, and then Newton's sleep. It's a kind of a sleep. We fall into a slumber, and then we try to say that slumber, that state of slumber, is the only reality. And as I go into the rest of the article, the negation of mind is just one. Everyone thinks the hard problem. How does mind affect any material stuff? That's just this. This has been blown up as the big problem. Blake noted it, but said it's just one of the problems. It's one of the problems that sort of domino effect. Once you've got that problem and you can't resolve it, because he could resolve it in seconds. But if you can't resolve it, then unfortunately, many other things that are not problems are seen as problems, become problems because of this divided mind. Now we would say divided brain. But Blake didn't have that nomenclature in then, to know about the governing aspects of brain. So the article, I just confined the article to talking about his proofs. And by the way, he didn't write that down. He says, the thing I get with emails, I'm paraphrasing a mighty corpus of work that includes Berkeley and includes others, and I'm giving you in a synopsis of what he thought, that if he was in the room, he would agree. And then hoping that you'll take that on. It's not actually what Blake himself said. He was a poet. And that means he was deeply into illusion and connotation, and therefore it's left to you to do the mental homework, to put together what is he actually saying, so that's my interpretation of what he's saying.
Excellent, thank you for that. Those looms of Locke, and I think we're caught ourselves, are very much caught up in those looms of Locke today. It's a shame they didn't get more into Blake back in the day than Locke. Let's see here. We have this one we'll save for maybe another time. It's a lot going on, like you say. Are there any other article or artwork here?
No.
Okay.
I can just say that he was yeah, he was fighting a worldview that had great traction.
Hmm.
And he wrote in such a way, because he wrote in poetry, it was a perfect way to ignore him. The mad poet
Ah, yes.
from London, So every conceivable diatribe was hurled against him. He was very poor. He lived all his life in abject poverty. And so he died obscure. If it wasn't for the famous Pre-Raphaelite artist, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, we
Mm.
wouldn't have heard about Blake at all. We wouldn't have heard about Blake at all. His brother Michael had told him, who's an author, his sister, of course, Christina Rossetti, was a world famous poet. He was told by his family members that there was this auction of Blake's stuff. Dante didn't have any money, so he ran off to somebody and got a few coins and ran across town to buy what became known as the Rossetti manuscripts. And I think this included the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, but at least he was able to get these. If he hadn't been able to get those, you can better believe that Blake would not have been heard of at all. So we owe one genius, Rossetti, who was a master poet,
Yes.
who loved Blake's work and knew about Blake and had visited some exhibitions, featuring Blake's work. So Blake was already dead by the time the Pre-Raphaelites came online. But given their adoration of him, we're fortunate. So whether you like Rossetti's own artwork or not, or his own poetry or not, you've got to give him several stars for discovering, Blake. Just in the same way that the famous poet Ezra Pound discovered the work of Vivaldi. Yeah. So it does happen. Yeah.
It's a terrible shudder to think about how many figures in history of genius perhaps have fallen through the cracks in the way that Blake nearly did.
Well, I specialize in those guys. And my work is motivated by making sure that their names, it's my only motive. I have no interest in doing this work, but for that, which is to at least bring even in a flimsy way, these names back, because it might inspire others, and it might inspire people behind the walls of academia, for all you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I hope our time together here, Michael, has inspired the viewers to delve into, first of all, your article to get a good grasp on William Blake, and then on perhaps even inspire them to pursue that a bit more, to the man's actual words and art and poems and whatnot. Michael, before we knock off here, what could you tease us with what projects we might keep an eye out for coming up? Any articles or podcasts or anything to keep an ear to the track for?
Yeah, we've got yourself coming on soon. We have a few other guests. Maybe some articles. I don't really think too much about the future. I just do what I do, There is the new book, but again, there's no date on that. It might be next year, the middle of the year. I'd love to be, because of my eye problems right now, it's very difficult to write articles and sit on the screen. Some might dictate, some might write myself. You have to really write them yourself at the end of the day, so we're looking into that problem. But I could write articles, from now to doomsday. But again, if you're coming to Blake, try to don't be doing what we're doing in the beginning. Enjoy it first. Read him as he is and let it seep in and let it enrich you on that level. Because we're teasing out his actual philosophies. But if you go to a museum in England, at the Tate Gallery downstairs, there's a Blake section, and there's others places he lived and so on. When you go there, just try to absorb his iconography. Compare it and contrast it with others. Go to look at Swedenborg, and that kind of. Berkeley would be, I mentioned him as well. We could come on next time and maybe do something on Berkeley, because his ideas are very apropos, actually. Blake can be understood a lot by, comparing and contrasting him to, say, another great thinker. A lot, and Berkeley would be the one I would think on. Malebranche, but then he's even before these guys. He's way back in the 1500s. So just sticking closer to Blake himself. His predecessor, George Berkeley, after whom the California University or the town of Berkeley, which I know very well, it was named. And it's just too bad that it's a bastion of materialism, even though it's named after a great anti-materialist. Can you go figure that? Talk about bizarrities, right? Here it is churning out the very looms of Locke, that we spoke of earlier. Absolutely horrific, but and also they have champions of materialism that are writing books now as we speak. These George Lakoffs, I've done work on him. If people check out my article called Mysticism, Truth or Falsity, they'll have a little snippet there. It's on the same website. There's a little bit of a diatribe. So when you asked about future projects, I've got Hegel Part 3 coming out. I've done a premium series. People should watch 1 and 2 in order to, be ready for 3. I've got 5 more parts of an idealism mega, production in premium that it's done. I just have to edit it. I've got one on catastrophism, a real mammoth thing on Velikovsky and Beaumont. I've got a history of the Jews, part 1, to clear up a lot of nonsense about that. I've got, Hegel, part 3. Another one we're working on called Metaphors We Live By, which is very apropos to a lot of things we've spoken of, about this time grammar, in the sense of how the deconstructionists, people like Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty and that crowd, how they have illegitimately ransacked and destroyed, well, this would be one of your topics, education, because they've taken down the tradition by using linguistic philosophy, or it's not even philosophy, it's linguistic anomalies, which got imported disingenuously, I believe, into world philosophy. They made some interesting discoveries in the terms of linguistics and semiotics, but who told them to import this into the Western tradition of philosophy to then completely destroy all texts and the narratives and the thinking behind those texts, to come up with, I don't know if it was Derrida's own line, all statements are lies. This kind of nonsense. Oh, is it? Is it? And then people like me sitting waiting for the rebuttals, and all hearing is critics for 50, 60, 100. There's nobody there to say, let me show you the error of your ways. They're all dead, and there's nobody. Everybody just joined the party because it had so much money behind it, and Derrida got an honorary degree from Columbia. All of that. Well, because of my members, something I've wanted to do for a very, very long time, which is go after them and their progeny, because Derrida is himself gone, and Rorty's gone. So the little Rortys are all running around, infecting. So their philosophies are, you can't take them down, starting with George Berkeley, Blake, yes, but other men as well, like Owen Barfield. There's a way to take them down. So I've got this mammoth one in the wings, the introduction of it, and then we'll go in. There'll be 2 and 3 and 4, but those will specifically deal. But first I have this lengthy introduction to get people who have never heard of this before into the framework of how language, grammar, syntax, it deals with percepts and concepts. So that's wonderful. And I love working on that, because I know it's going to be a gem, an absolute gem. It's been decades, because it ties into poetry, doesn't it? These men denuded poetry of its meaning, denuded texts. That means Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, whoever, Blake. And we're not going to go into it now, but they were denuding that of its essence, and doing it completely disingenuously. So my effort is to prove that fact. And so we have a wonderful presentation now that you ask, ready for that after, and I hope it won't be too long before that's out. It's really one of the master work, and there's other projects like that also on the table, actually.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you for taking a few minutes, more than a few minutes, to really elaborate on William Blake for us here. You have a lot of irons in the fire, so thanks for stepping away from the forge for a little bit there. Thank you so much.
No, you're most welcome, John. I always love speaking with you, mate.
And thank you to the viewers for watching. Michael's stuff will be, again, down below in the description. Take care, everyone.